Europe's car industry has been saved from disaster for now after a last-minute deal between China and the US over the export of computer chips. But how long will this truce in the trade war really last? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, last month, the Netherlands took control of the Chinese-owned, Dutch-based chipmaker Nexperia after the US raised security concerns about its CEO. In response, Beijing halted exports of the company's finished products. Europe's car industry was warning it was just days away from a shutdown. That appears to be avoided for now.
When these two superpowers met last week, they agreed to a thaw in their increasingly tense relations and a truce in their trade war. Crucially for European automobile manufacturers, the deal has led to an easing of an export ban on Chinese computer chips, which had threatened to bring the car industry to a standstill. Beijing has said it will allow some semiconductors made by Nexperia to be exported. A ban on exports erupted after the Dutch government used a law last enacted during the Cold War to seize control of the Netherlands-based but Chinese-owned chipmaker after the US raised security concerns about its CEO.
In the end, we have to calm down. We need a cool head. We need to think about the global world, and also other countries like the Netherlands, other countries should not be playing a chess for the U.S. This grand containment strategy, because U.S. is really shifted gear now. U.S. wants to have more stability, strategic stability, rather than strategic rivalry.
During the talks in South Korea, Trump and Xi agreed on a one-year truce in their trade war. Trump is spinning this deal as the result of his tough tariff-wielding policy, but to many, this looks like a successful Chinese pushback.
We have a deal. Now, every year we'll renegotiate the deal, but I think the deal will go on for a long time, long beyond the year. We'll negotiate at the end of the year, but all of the rare earth has been settled, and that's for the world.
If the geopolitical plates keep shifting, Europe's production lines could once again be forced to hit the brakes. And without a gear shift away from over-reliance on Chinese chips, the wheels could come off completely.
Well, let's meet our guests. Joining us from Birmingham, we have David Bailey. David is an economics professor at Birmingham Business School. I'm delighted to say, here with me in the studio, I'm joined by Isabel Hilton from the China Dialogue Trust. And alongside her, we have Steve Nash, who's a former executive at BMW. You're all very welcome to this roundtable. Steve, to you first of all, just bring us up to speed here. Why are these microchips so very important in modern car manufacturing?
Well, first of all, I mean, if you're talking about the Nexperian chips, they're not super sophisticated, but they're used all over the cars. They're used in all manner of systems, some safety-related systems, but they proliferate throughout modern cars. So without them, it's very difficult to put the cars on the road.
And the supply chains, they're embedded in every aspect of car manufacturing.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the case of Nexperian, it's a mix between the Dutch part of the company and the Chinese part of the company. I think. But 70% of those chips are packaged and distributed in China. So that's where the blockage comes.
David, to you, just on the whole manufacturing process with these microchips then, is that very strange that they make them in the Netherlands, this company Nexperia, and then they're carted all the way to China for packaging? Is there anything odd about that?
Well, the making of the silicon, the wafer chips, which those of us that are old enough will remember, they look a bit like DVDs. That's actually the high-tech part of the process. So it's the printing of those chips onto the silicon wafers that's difficult. And that's something China still struggles to do. Even those, as Steve said, these aren't the most advanced chips. They're then sent over to China to be basically sliced up and packaged and then re-exported. So we've got these very long supply chains, which has been done over many years in order to get costs down. What we're seeing now, of course, is that those long supply chains are exposed to all sorts of things, including geopolitical tension, when the US in particular and China are kind of at loggerheads, so they get snarled up. And certainly I think in this case, going forwards, Nexperia is going to have to look at where that supply chain goes. It will have to look for alternative places to process them in Southeast Europe, Southeast Asia, and also maybe Europe as well.
Thank you, David. Isabel, talking of tension, it strikes me that Europe is suffering off the back of two superpowers going head to head with trade wars and tariffs. And it's car manufacturers in Germany, Italy, the UK, France who are really struggling.
That's true up to a point, and certainly the US put some pressure on the Dutch to intervene, as they did with the company. But the Dutch were already quite concerned. They were concerned that the intellectual property would go to China, that the Chinese owners of Nexperia, which was a Dutch company, as we hear, and still operates in the Netherlands, but that it might be shipped out to China. So the Dutch government sought guarantees from the company that this wouldn't happen. The company said it couldn't give those guarantees. And then, of course, the American tensions pile in and the Dutch intervened and effectively took over the company. And that precipitated the Mexican standoff that we have now. So the Dutch stopped supplying wafers to China. China stopped supplying completed chips to Europe. And you know, here we are. But actually, there are longer running concerns with Nexperia. I don't know if you remember a company called Newport Fab. That's a British company in Wales, which Nexperia had a very big stake in. And the British government became concerned about the Chinese influence on Nexperia, and they forced the sale. They forced Nexperia to sell that company. It's now owned by an American company and continues to operate. So, you know, there is a backstory here, and the backstory is about Chinese domination and the security concerns for all of Europe, as well as the United States, that implies.
Steve, just come in on these security concerns then. So the Dutch were, as I've read, acting on intelligence from the Americans or perhaps even pressure from the United States?
Probably pressure, yeah.
Pressure?
Yeah. I mean, look, there is no doubt that there is sort of collateral damage for Europe with this kind of power struggle between America, particularly the Trump style of America, the sort of hardball, you know, and ironically, I mean, he claims that he's done a bit of a deal with Xi and that the chip supply for American manufacturers may be easing up, but I mean that doesn't necessarily help us in Europe, and I don't suppose Donald Trump would overly care about that.
David, just come in on that point then. These security concerns. I mean, we're seeing this play out time and again. Different countries around Europe, Chinese companies, they make decisions, they've got their own leadership, and then the host country decides we don't quite think we can trust what you're doing here.
That's right. So the West for a long time has had a kind of double-edged kind of view of China. On the one hand, we've wanted the investment, but at the same time, countries increasingly are concerned about the security implications of that. So there's been a kind of on-off relationship with China over many, many years. Since Trump has come to power, that has become much more acute because he's wanted to decouple the US from China, and he also wants to take Europe with the US in terms of that decoupling. That leaves certain industries, which are heavily reliant on Chinese components, pretty exposed, as we're seeing in this current case. In terms of Nexperia. Now, and the reason why that's important, about 50% of the chips, it's thought, that go into European automotive, into the airbags, into the door locking, into the wing mirrors, come from this one company. That company makes about 100 billion chips a year, so it's literally chips with everything. Now, alternative supplies may be available. That's going to take a long time to come on stream. And in the meanwhile, if China is continuing to restrict the exports of these chips, the European industry has a problem.
Isabel, just come in on what Steve said a moment ago about Europe being a pawn almost in this game. I mean, where does the power lie here? I get the impression it's not with us.
No, it's not with us. It's either with. I mean, we saw in the meeting between Trump and Xi Jinping last week in South Korea, for the first time, China was described quite widely as a peer competitor. In other words, China's got strength equal to those of the United States. And in that particular trade standoff, which had gone on for months and with repeated rounds of negotiations, the Chinese had produced regulations that controlled, for example, rare earth magnets and a whole series of critical components that China has a chokehold on. So it introduced regulations not dissimilar to the kind of thing the United States does, which means that they can calibrate the pressure. So the licenses just slow down, so you don't quite get your supply. And if you're trying to run a factory which was kind of built and operated on just-in-time supply chains, you're really in a mess. You're highly exposed. People don't have the stocks, and they don't have the weapons to push back. Whereas the United States has some muscle that it can push back. They're pretty evenly matched at the moment. But, like the old African saying goes, when two elephants fight, the grass gets trampled. And I'm afraid we're in the position of the grass.
We're the grass. Yes. Steve, it's been a very difficult year for manufacturing in the automotive industry in Europe. Just looking at everything that's happening at the moment, how worrying is it that China makes a decision and those conveyor belts in factories from Wolfsburg in Germany to Solihull in the English Midlands can just stop?
That's incredibly worrying. I mean, look, the extent to which we're locked into China, unfortunately, is far greater than most people realise. And although, as David has alluded to, finding alternative supplies is possible, but it takes a long time. Bear in mind that the homologation process for new chips and things, because a lot of them are involved in safety-related systems, it takes a long time. I think as well, and even then, a lot of the raw materials we need, you talk about rare earths, I mean, unfortunately, and I think you used the right term, that China has the chokehold on a lot of those. If you're building electric cars, they own 90-odd% of the supply chain for all the raw materials. So you can't, thumb your nose at China and say, well, go it alone, because you can't. You can't. So to some extent, pragmatism has to come into that. I think the other thing is, the other big challenge for manufacturers, and David probably comment on that, but the just-in-time, supply process that we've talked about has saved manufacturers huge amounts of money in inventory costs and so on. Naturally, I think that, they have to, I mean, they considered it after the pandemic. Now they have to reconsider it even more strongly, holding more inventories and stuff. But that has a cost impact at a time when the industry is really struggling.
David, just on that point, talking of struggling, you're speaking to us from Birmingham in the English Midlands. The town of Solihull is pretty much completely dependent on Jaguar Land Rover. There was a big cyber attack there in August, which caused hundreds of millions of dollars of damage to the UK economy. How will people at JLR be feeling about, not receiving the microchips and thinking, we've had a cyber attack, we've had production disrupted, and now this?
It's the last thing they need, isn't it? I mean, JLR, went through 5 weeks of not producing after that cyber attack, and that had a huge impact on the supply chain, particularly smaller firms in the supply chain. So a huge impact on the firm and the wider economy. About 200,000 people dependent on the firm, by the way, in one form or another. So it's now kind of scaling production back up. And then all of a sudden, coming out of nowhere is this concern over chips. And even if JLR themselves aren't directly exposed, maybe they've arranged alternative supplies, their suppliers certainly are. So the companies that are supplying the airbags and the central locking and the wind mirrors are going to be affected by that. So the last thing JLR needs is further disruption when it's trying to get back onto its feet. But I'd argue that more broadly, the British and European industry has been through pretty much a perfect storm. Falling sales in China, slow take-up of electric vehicles, the tariffs from the US, the costs of having to invest in new technology. This is yet another hit for an industry which has faced squeezed profits over the last couple of years.
And David, in terms of competing with China, is Europe now at a stage where, when it comes to making cars and vehicles, that This is not even a fair fight.
In terms of the electric vehicles, which is the way we're going, then China has got a 35 to 40% cost advantage. They've been at this for 25 years. Europe was a latecomer. There's been huge support from the Chinese government, hundreds of billions of euros of support. China has got down its learning curve. It's got its costs down. It's not just cost, by the way. They've also innovated. So some of the battery technology in some of the cars is now better than in a Tesla, for example. So things have completely turned around. It's Europe that needs to catch up with China. And this idea that somehow Europe can do that without China, I think is just not possible. Europe has to attract Chinese investment into Europe in order to build batteries and build Chinese cars. Europe isn't going to be able to go it on its own.
Isabel, you know China inside out. Just on that point about investment coming in from Chinese companies, governments are going to be slightly concerned, aren't they? That yes, loads of money, that's very, very good for our country. However, what happens when a government doesn't like a decision-making process that some Chinese executive has put together in, whether it is the Netherlands or Italy or the UK?
Well, that is certainly a concern. I mean, the Chinese also do need outward investment. I mean, at the moment, what you have as a result of all these subsidies and this spectacular growth in the Chinese EV industry is that you have literally hundreds of companies competing ferociously in China against each other, forcing down prices. Nobody's making money. And you've got an increasing pressure to dump what are called zero mileage used cars in all sorts of markets. There is really an air of desperation to the scene in China. And one remedy is and a remedy against the kind of tariffs that the European Union has put on as countervailing tariffs to compensate for the subsidies in China, so to even the playing field a bit. The remedy for that is to build factories in the markets that you want to sell into. So you've got investment, Cattle, for example, which is one of the battery companies investing in Hungary. You've got quite a lot of movement now for Chinese companies to build factories in the markets that they want to access. Now, yes, that does imply some pressure, but the pressure is a bit both ways. The Chinese need this to work too. So I think that if we were, for example, to apply the same rules to Chinese companies as China applies to Tesla in China, on security, on where the data is stored, on restrictions, in fact, on where these can be driven, then it's it's an even playing field. And we also need to demand, as China did of us when we invested in China, intellectual property transfer.
Steve, I just want to pick up on a phrase Isabel used there, zero mileage used car. Why would you ever have a zero mileage used car? Just explain that. Sorry, I don't understand.
To be honest, the methods might be a little bit different from the Chinese manufacturer, but it's a time-honoured process of manufacturers moving product which doesn't yet have a customer. So it's a way of gaining registrations. The cars are registered, got little or no mileage on them. Delivery mileage is a nice phrase. And then you rely on your dealer networks to kind of retail them. I think it has to be understood that car manufacturers are essentially a sausage machine, and it's a sausage machine that in an ideal world is on a ratchet, never goes backwards. So the numbers are expected to sort of go on upwards until eternity, and that's why you end up quite often with cars that, more cars than customers, and this is a way of moving that product.
And tell me, what do you think now European car manufacturers should be doing? What are the learnings from this Nexperia situation?
I mean, without doubt, they'll be working feverishly to find new suppliers, to get away from situations where you have, ideally, where you have a single supplier for a key component, so that there's a bit more robustness. They will, despite the cost, be looking to build more inventory of key components. But I think that as we've heard, you can't. There isn't any way in which they can unlock themselves from a certain amount of dependence on China. So, more collaborations, and bringing more of the Chinese supply side into Europe. All of those things will be essential. I think it was really interesting what you said earlier on about America talking about China as a peer. I think it's been hard for the legacy, as we might call them, the Western car manufacturers, to accept that 5 minutes ago they were in China showing the Chinese how to do it, and making really good money into the process. Suddenly, the apprentice has become the master. And that's quite difficult to deal with. But the quicker you accept that and move to the new reality, the better.
David, they really should have seen this coming in Europe, shouldn't they?
Yes, absolutely. Both in terms of the push of EVs from China, which has got costs down and improved the technology dramatically, but also in the specifics of this Nexperia case. The Dutch government may well have good reasons for why it took control of Nexperia because of concerns about intellectual property transfer to China. But if you're going to take control of it, you should expect retaliation from China. And that retaliation was swift and it was brutal in terms of the stopping of the exports of the finished product. So I think the Dutch government has got some kind of catching up to do in terms of thinking through the implications when it takes this kind of action. And in this case, Nexperia really needs alternative processing facilities very, very quickly. Otherwise, it's going to be the Chinese government deciding who gets the license for which chips at which time. I'm still not convinced, by the way, that China's really eased up that much on this. It has control to turn this on and off whenever it wants.
David, do you think part of the problem here in Europe is that we've got politicians making decisions about huge business, and politicians are very short-term? They just care about the next election, whereas business likes stability and looks to the future?
Very much so. And business hates uncertainty. That affects investment. That affects the ability to invest in new products going forwards. And what we've seen in recent years is massive uncertainty. We've seen it in terms of the impact of Brexit. We've seen it in Trump's tariffs. We're seeing it in terms of this standoff between the US and China. That's really bad for business going forwards. But at the same time, as Steve was saying, given enough time, business will find its ways around that, whether it's finding new suppliers, having supplies just in case rather than just in time, and longer term thinking about bringing the Chinese into the supply chain in Europe.
Isabel, at what point will someone in Europe think, let's make our own?
Make our own
Microchips, that we can do this ourselves, that we don't need Chinese involvement?
I'm sure there are a lot of people scratching their heads and thinking, how quickly can we pivot or at least diversify? Because those are the lessons of the last few years. But actually, if you think back to the beginning of globalization, what did these companies want in China? They wanted cheap manufacturing and they wanted access to one of the world's biggest markets. And that was. They had very good times for quite a long time, particularly in Germany. And now it's over. I think they were very slow to realize that it was over, that their market share in China's going down. German car manufacturers, who were the best in the world at the internal combustion engine, never believed the Chinese could produce something that could destroy their market. And they did. And now everyone is scrambling around trying to figure out, how do we pivot? How do we maintain our sales enough so that we have the capital to invest in what we need to invest in for the future, and what relationship should we have with China? So that's a whole complicated set of decisions to make, and embedded in the middle of that are these little computer chips, which we all use, and that's another very big thing we have to figure out.
Steve, has European arrogance played a part here then?
A bit, yeah, without doubt. It's interesting, I saw an interview recently with Jim Farley, the CEO of Ford, and he was being very open in talking about just how good the Chinese products are and how technically advanced they are, way beyond anything that the non-Chinese car industry is capable of. Because from day one, they've been locked into, the tech companies like Huawei and so on, whereas outside of China, the likes of Apple and Amazon have dabbled but have walked away from the car industry. So the technology they have is exceptionally good, and it has taken too long for us to realise that I mean, look, if you go right back to first base, the whole world saw what China was doing with the Belt and Road Scheme. Going into developing countries and building airports and building roads and so on in exchange for their lithium, in exchange for their rare earths and so on. We all saw that in plain sight. Nobody actually worked out what it would mean, But here we are today, and they've got 90-odd% of the supply chain for batteries.
For decades to come.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, we've got to get brighter and wake up to what we're dealing with and move quicker.
David, final point to you. Is this the end of this row now, or is this likely to rear its head again whenever China wants to put some pressure on Europe or America?
It could well do. And I think China's in a position whereby it can make decisions about granting licenses about these chips. The Europeans have got to find alternative supplies. Nexperia's got to look for alternative processing. I think longer term, what both of the guests in the studio said, it raises also a fundamental question about, does Europe want to keep its manufacturing base, particularly in cars? If it does, then the scale of capital expenditure needs to increase dramatically. We saw the case of Northvolt, which was meant to be Europe's great hope in terms of battery making, despite attracting 15 billion euros, going bust. So starting this on your own is almost impossible. The industry and the European governments need to think about how they cooperate with China.
David, thank you. We've run out of road on this roundtable. Steve, Isabel, thank you so much for your insight as well. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all the team here, goodbye, and thank you for watching.